The fight that ruined Billy Collins Jr. forever. Billy Ray Collins Jr. was born on 21 September 1961 in Nashville, Tennessee, into a boxing family. His father, Billy Collins Sr., had been a professional fighter himself, competing in the welterweight division during the 1960s and early 1970s. When his own career ended, Collins Sr. became a trainer, and his son became his most promising pupil. Young Billy showed natural talent from an early age. He possessed quick hands, solid fundamentals, and the kind of aggressive, come-forward style that made for exciting fights. More importantly, he had the dedication and work ethic that separated genuine prospects from gym fighters. He trained obsessively, studied the sport's technical aspects, and approached boxing with the seriousness of someone who understood that success required absolute commitment. Collins turned professional in 1981 at the age of 19. Fighting primarily in the New York area, he compiled an impressive record whilst developing his skills against progressively tougher opposition. His style was straightforward but effective: constant pressure, solid body punching, and the willingness to walk through shots to land his own. He wasn't the most technically sophisticated fighter, but he was tough, determined, and genuinely skilled. By mid-1983, Collins's professional record stood at 14-0 with 11 knockouts. This was a legitimate undefeated record built against credible opposition, not the padded statistics that some prospects accumulated against deliberately weak opponents. Boxing observers recognized Collins as a genuine welterweight prospect who, with continued development, could compete for a world title within a few years. At 21 years old, Collins was exactly where a young fighter should be: undefeated, improving with each fight, and positioned to step up to more significant challenges. His father managed his career carefully, matching him against opponents who would test him without overwhelming him, building his experience and confidence systematically. The next step in Collins' development was a fight against Luis Resto, scheduled for 16th June 1983 at Madison Square Garden in New York City. The bout was part of the undercard for a larger event, a 10-round welterweight contest that would give Collins valuable experience against a fighter with a respectable record. Resto was a 28-year-old Puerto Rican fighter with a professional record of 20-8-2. He was a journeyman, a fighter who provided tough opposition for prospects but wasn't considered championship material himself. His record suggested he was exactly the kind of opponent Collins should be fighting at this stage of his development, experienced enough to be a genuine test, but not so dangerous that the fight represented an unreasonable risk. The fight appeared to be a smart matchup for Collins. A victory over Resto would add another quality name to his record and move him closer to contender status. There was no reason to expect anything unusual or dangerous beyond the normal risks inherent in professional boxing. What nobody knew, what nobody could have known, was that Resto's trainer, Carlos Panama Lewis, had prepared something that had nothing to do with boxing skill, training, or legitimate competition. Panama Lewis was planning to turn the fight into something else entirely. Something criminal, something that would destroy Billy Collins Jr.'s life and career completely. Panama Lewis was a controversial figure in boxing, known for pushing ethical boundaries and being willing to do whatever it took to win. He'd been involved in boxing for years, training fighters in New York gyms, and had developed a reputation as someone who understood the sport's technical aspects but cared little for its rules or traditions. In the days before the Resto-Collins fight, Lewis had made modifications to Resto's gloves that transformed them from protective equipment into weapons. The exact nature of these modifications wouldn't be discovered until after the fight, but their effect would be immediately and devastatingly apparent once the bout began. For Billy Collins Jr., 16th of June 1983 began as just another fight night, an opportunity to improve to 15-0, to gain more experience, to move one step closer to his dream of becoming a world champion. He arrived at Madison Square Garden with his father, went through his pre-fight routine, and prepared mentally and physically for what he expected to be a tough but winnable fight. He had no way of knowing that he was about to step into the ring for a fight that should never have happened, against an opponent who was hiding a dark secret inside his gloves. He had no way of knowing that the next 30 minutes would destroy everything he'd worked for his entire life: Billy Collins Jr. was a 21-year-old undefeated prospect with a bright future ahead of him. By the end of that night, his career, his health, and ultimately his life would be ruined by one of the most shameful criminal acts in boxing history. The night everything changed. The evening of 16th of June 1983 at Madison Square Garden began routinely for Billy Collins, Jr. He went through his familiar pre-fight rituals, warming up, having his hands wrapped by his father, receiving final tactical instructions. The atmosphere was typical of an undercard bout at boxing's most famous venue. Anticipation mixed with the controlled tension that precedes any professional fight. Luis Resto entered the ring first, followed by Collins. The referee provided his final instructions. The fighters touched gloves. The opening bell rang, and immediately something was wrong. From the very first exchange, Collins felt impacts that didn't match what gloves should feel like. Resto's punches landed with unusual hardness, a sharp, jarring quality that seemed wrong. Professional fighters develop an instinctive sense of what punches should feel like. The impact cushioned by glove padding, the force distributed across the surface area. Resto's punches felt different, harder, more concentrated, more painful. Collins fought back aggressively, true to his come-forward style, but with each exchange, he absorbed shots that seemed to cause disproportionate damage. His face began swelling almost immediately. Cuts opened around his eyes. Blood flowed from his nose and mouth. The accumulation of damage was happening faster than it should, more severely than his previous 14 fights had prepared him for. Resto, normally a journeyman who struggled against quality opposition, fought with confidence that suggested he knew something Collins didn't. He threw punches without the usual concern for his opponent's defensive capabilities. He worked systematically on Collins's face, targeting the eyes, the nose, the areas where damage would be most visible and debilitating. Between rounds, Billy Collins Sr. worked frantically in his son's corner, trying to stem bleeding and reduce swelling. But the damage was accumulating at a rate that didn't make sense. Collins Sr., who'd been around boxing his entire life, recognized that something wasn't right about how quickly his son's face was being destroyed. Round after round, Collins absorbed punishment that was changing his appearance grotesquely. His eyes swelled nearly shut. His face became a mask of blood and contusions. He fought bravely, continuing to press forward despite the damage. But he was fighting a battle he couldn't win because the rules of normal competition had been abandoned. Resto continued landing shots with that same unusual, devastating impact. His confidence grew as the fight progressed and Collins's face deteriorated. Panama Lewis, working Resto's corner, showed no concern about the damage being inflicted, no recognition that what was happening went far beyond the acceptable violence of professional boxing. The crowd at Madison Square Garden watched in growing discomfort. Whilst boxing audiences expect violence, there was something disturbing about the systematic destruction of Collins's face. The damage seemed disproportionate to what the fight's action should have produced, but nobody yet understood why. Collins survived all 10 rounds through sheer toughness and courage. When the final bell rang, he'd absorbed perhaps 300 punches, many landing on his increasingly defenseless face. The judges' scorecards reflected Resto's dominance. He won a unanimous decision, his first significant victory in years. But the real story wasn't the decision. It was Billy Collins Jr.'s face. As Collins left the ring, his appearance shocked everyone who saw him. His face was so severely damaged that he was barely recognizable. Both eyes were swollen nearly completely shut. His nose was broken and displaced. Cuts covered his face. The swelling was so severe that he looked like a victim of a severe beating, rather than a boxer who'd lost a competitive fight. Billy Collins, Sr., seeing his son's condition, immediately suspected something was terribly wrong. This wasn't normal boxing damage. He confronted Resto's corner, demanding to examine Resto's gloves. Panama Lewis refused, attempting to leave the ring quickly with the gloves. But Collins Sr. persisted, and with the help of ring officials and New York State Athletic Commission inspectors, Resto's gloves were finally examined. What they discovered confirmed Collins Sr.'s worst suspicions. The padding in Resto's gloves had been tampered with. Someone had removed a significant portion of the horsehair padding that normally cushions the impact of punches, leaving the gloves harder, flatter, and far more dangerous. Resto had essentially been hitting Collins with barely padded fists wrapped in thin leather, closer to bare-knuckle fighting than legitimate boxing. The discovery triggered immediate chaos. Commission officials confiscated the gloves as evidence. Police were summoned. Resto and Lewis were detained and questioned. The boxing world, represented by the officials and fighters present at Madison Square Garden that night, realized they'd witnessed not a sporting contest, but a criminal assault. Billy Collins, Jr. was transported to hospital for examination and treatment. The medical assessment revealed the extent of the damage. His face had sustained severe trauma, broken bones, torn tissues, permanent scarring. But most devastatingly, his eyes had been permanently damaged. The repeated impacts from the tampered gloves had caused injuries that would affect his vision for the rest of his life. In the hospital, as doctors treated his injuries, the full horror of what had happened began to sink in. Collins had stepped into the ring believing he was participating in a regulated, supervised sporting contest. Instead, he'd been the victim of a premeditated criminal act, a deliberate assault disguised as a boxing match. The physical damage was obvious and immediate. But the psychological damage, the violation of trust, the betrayal of everything boxing was supposed to represent, would prove equally devastating. The dark secret revealed the immediate aftermath of the Collins-Resto fight, transformed Madison Square Garden from a boxing venue into a crime scene. The gloves that Luis Resto had worn were confiscated by New York State Athletic Commission officials and handed over to police investigators. What they discovered upon detailed examination confirmed the worst suspicions and revealed the full scope of the criminal conspiracy. The gloves had been systematically tampered with in a way that required premeditation and technical knowledge. Someone had removed a substantial portion of the padding, the horsehair and foam that normally cushions impacts and distributes force across the glove's surface. What remained was primarily the leather shell with minimal internal protection. When Resto threw punches, Collins was essentially being hit with thin leather wrapped around Resto's fist and hand wrappings, with almost none of the cushioning that boxing gloves are designed to provide. The modification was sophisticated enough that it hadn't been detected during the pre-fight glove inspection, which was typically cursory. Inspectors would check that gloves met weight and size requirements, but they didn't routinely squeeze or manipulate them to detect removed padding. Panama Lewis had exploited this gap in the inspection process, but the glove tampering was only part of the criminal scheme. Investigators also discovered that Resto's hand wraps contained an illegal hardening substance. Plaster of Paris had been mixed into the wrapping material. This created a cast-like hardness around Resto's fists, further increasing the impact force of his punches. The combination of hardened hand wraps and padding-depleted gloves transformed Resto's fists into weapons far more dangerous than anything permitted in professional boxing. The investigation quickly focused on Panama Lewis as the architect of the scheme. Resto claimed, and would maintain for years, that he'd been unaware of the modifications, that Lewis had prepared his gloves and wraps without telling him what had been done. This claim was met with widespread skepticism. Professional fighters are intimately familiar with how their gloves should feel. The difference between properly padded gloves and ones with padding removed would be immediately apparent to anyone wearing them. The New York State Athletic Commission moved swiftly. Luis Resto's boxing license was immediately suspended. Panama Lewis's trainer's license was revoked. Criminal charges were filed against both men. The commission also launched a broader investigation into Lewis's previous fights, examining whether this had been an isolated incident or part of a pattern. The criminal prosecution proceeded through New York's legal system. Resto and Lewis were charged with assault, criminal possession of a weapon, the tampered gloves, and conspiracy. The trial, held in 1986, featured testimony from boxing officials, medical experts, and Billy Collins Sr., who described watching his son being systematically beaten with illegal equipment whilst believing it was a legitimate boxing match. The medical testimony was particularly damning. Doctors explained how the removed padding and hardened wraps had caused injuries far more severe than normal boxing punches would produce. Collins's facial bones had been fractured in ways consistent with being struck with hard objects, rather than properly padded gloves. His eye injuries, which would prove permanent, were attributable to the concentrated force of impacts that should have been cushioned. The jury convicted both Resto and Lewis. Resto received a sentence of 3 years in prison, though he served approximately 2.5 years. Lewis received a 6-year sentence but served less than 3 years. Both men were also banned for life from boxing by the New York State Athletic Commission, and other jurisdictions followed suit, effectively ending their involvement in the sport. The convictions represented justice in the legal sense, but they couldn't undo the damage. Billy Collins, Jr. His career was over. His face bore permanent scars. His eyes had sustained damage that affected his depth perception and overall vision, injuries that meant he could never box again even if he'd wanted to. The boxing world reacted with shock and condemnation. The sport has always existed in an uncomfortable space between athletic competition and controlled violence, but certain lines were never supposed to be crossed. What Lewis and Resto had done violated not just boxing's rules but its fundamental premise, that fighters enter the ring on equal terms, with their safety protected by regulations and equipment standards. The scandal prompted changes in pre-fight inspection procedures. Athletic commissions began conducting more thorough glove examinations, physically manipulating them to detect tampering. Hand wrap procedures became more standardized and supervised. The Collins-Resto fight became a case study in boxing's regulatory curriculum, an example of what happens when safety protocols are inadequate and criminal intent exploits the gaps. But these reforms came too late for Billy Collins, Jr. At 22 years old, with an undefeated professional record and a bright future, he was finished as a boxer. The physical damage was permanent. The psychological trauma was profound. He'd been betrayed by the sport he loved, victimized by criminals who disguised assault as competition. The immediate physical injuries would eventually heal, at least partially. His face would recover its basic structure, though scarring and some deformity remained permanent. But the eye damage was irreversible. His depth perception was compromised. His visual acuity was reduced. These weren't injuries a fighter could overcome through training or determination. They were career-ending, life-altering disabilities. Collins attempted to process what had happened to him, the betrayal, the violence, the abrupt end to everything he'd worked for since childhood. His father had trained him. They'd built his career together. They'd had plans, goals, dreams of a world championship. All of it was gone. Destroyed in 30 minutes by criminals wearing boxing gloves. The legal convictions provided some measure of justice, but they couldn't restore what had been taken. Resto and Lewis would serve their sentences and eventually be released. Billy Collins, Jr. would carry the consequences of their crime for the rest of his life. A life that was about to become much shorter than anyone could have imagined. The tragedy of Billy Collins, Jr. In the months following the Resto fight, Billy Collins, Jr. attempted to rebuild his life. The physical injuries were healing slowly. The facial swelling had subsided, though permanent scarring remained. But the eye damage was irreversible. Medical examinations confirmed what Collins had feared. His vision had been permanently compromised. His depth perception was impaired. His ability to judge distance and react to movement had been diminished. For a professional boxer, these injuries were catastrophic. Boxing requires precise depth perception to judge the distance of incoming punches and to land one's own shots accurately. Without it, a fighter is dangerously vulnerable. Even if athletic commissions had been willing to license him, which they weren't, given his documented eye damage, Collins couldn't have competed safely or effectively. At 22 years old, with an undefeated professional record of 14-0, Billy Collins Jr.'s boxing career was over. The dream he'd pursued since childhood, the future his father had carefully built for him, the championship aspirations that had seemed within reach, all of it was gone, stolen by criminals who'd turned a boxing ring into a crime scene. The psychological impact of this loss was devastating. Collins's entire identity had been built around boxing. He was a fighter. It was what he did, who he was, how he understood himself and his place in the world. The sport had given his life structure, purpose, and meaning. Without it, he felt lost. Depression set in quickly and deepened steadily. Collins struggled to find purpose in a life that no longer revolved around training, fighting, and working toward championship goals. He'd been robbed not just of his career, but of his future, his identity, and his sense of self-worth. The injustice of it, that he'd done nothing wrong, that his career had been destroyed through no fault of his own, made the loss even harder to bear. His father, Billy Collins Sr., watched helplessly as his son deteriorated psychologically. The elder Collins carried his own burden of guilt and rage. He'd been in his son's corner that night, had watched the damage accumulate, had suspected something was wrong but hadn't been able to stop it. He'd spent his life in boxing, understood its dangers and accepted them. But what had happened to his son wasn't boxing, it was criminal assault. Collins Sr. filed a civil lawsuit against Resto, Lewis Dawes, and Madison Square Garden, seeking damages for the destruction of his son's career and the permanent injuries inflicted. The legal process was slow and painful, forcing the Collins family to relive the trauma repeatedly through depositions, testimony, and court proceedings. Even if the lawsuit succeeded, and civil litigation against defendants with limited financial resources rarely produces substantial compensation, no amount of money could restore what had been taken. As 1983 turned to 1984, Billy Collins Jr.'s mental state continued to decline. He isolated himself from friends in the boxing community. He drank heavily, seeking temporary escape from the depression and anger that consumed him. He spoke often about the unfairness of what had happened, the theft of his future, the criminals who'd destroyed his life and would serve a few years in prison whilst he served a life sentence. On the 6th of March 1984, less than 9 months after the Resto fight, Billy Collins Jr. was driving his car in Tennessee. The circumstances of what happened next have never been entirely clear. His car left the road and struck a concrete abutment. The impact was severe. Collins was killed instantly. He was 22 years old. The official determination was that the crash was an accident, a single vehicle collision possibly caused by excessive speed or driver error. But those who knew Collins and understood his state of mind in the months before his death have long questioned whether it was truly accidental. The possibility that Collins had deliberately crashed his car, that his death was suicide rather than accident, has been discussed within boxing circles for decades. Whether Collins's death was accident or suicide, the responsibility for it extends beyond the moment of the crash. The depression that consumed him, the loss of identity and purpose that made life unbearable, the psychological trauma that may have led him to take his own life, all of it traced directly back to 16th of June 1983, and what Panama Lewis and Luis Resto had done to him in that ring. Billy Collins Sr. never recovered from his son's death. He continued to speak out about what had happened, to advocate for stricter regulation and harsher penalties for those who violated boxing's rules. He wanted his son remembered not as a victim, but as a talented fighter whose potential was stolen. He died in 2018, having spent 34 years living with the loss of his son, and the knowledge of how preventable that loss had been. Luis Resto served his prison sentence and was released. He attempted to resume boxing but found himself unemployable in the sport. His lifetime ban held. No legitimate promoter would work with him. He eventually expressed remorse, though whether that remorse was genuine or self-serving remained debatable. He admitted his role in the crime, but continued to minimize his responsibility, claiming he'd been manipulated by Lewis. Panama Lewis served his sentence and returned to boxing in various unofficial capacities, working in gyms and claiming to train fighters despite his lifetime ban. He showed no genuine remorse, offering only denials and self-justification. He died in 2020, having never accepted full responsibility for his crime. The legacy of the Collins-Resto fight extends beyond the immediate tragedy. The case became a watershed moment in boxing regulation, prompting reforms in glove inspection procedures, hand wrap supervision, and pre-fight safety protocols. Athletic commissions across America and internationally revised their procedures specifically to prevent a repeat of what happened to Billy Collins Jr. But these reforms, whilst important, couldn't change what had already happened. They couldn't restore Billy Collins Jr.'s career, heal his psychological trauma, or prevent his death. They were erected on the foundation of his suffering, improvements purchased at the price of his destroyed life. Billy Collins, Jr. should have had decades ahead of him. He should have competed for championships, built a career, perhaps eventually trained fighters himself as his father had trained him. Instead, he got 9 months of depression and despair, ended by a car crash that took his life before his 23rd birthday. His story stands as one of boxing's darkest chapters, a reminder that the sport's dangers extend beyond the risks inherent in competition to include the criminal acts of those willing to violate every principle of fair play and human decency. It is a story that demands to be remembered, not as entertainment but as tragedy, and told with the respect owed to a young man whose life was stolen by criminals who transformed a boxing ring into a weapon.